Was Calvin a miserable killjoy? That's the question for today's episode. I've spoken before about Calvin's dislike for dancing, and that can certainly give the impression that Calvin was a killjoy. Calvin gets into a really big controversy in Geneva because there's a wedding with one of the big wealthy families of Geneva, the Perra family, and they decide to flout the rule against dancing, and as a result, some of the women are actually thrown into prison for a while. And it's hard not to sympathise with those people, right? Who doesn't love a good dance at a wedding? My guess would be that Calvin is trying to avoid what he sees as maybe some of the excesses, so maybe the drunkenness and sexual immorality that sometimes accompany these kinds of events, but still, taken on its own, it might kind of reinforce this idea that Calvin was a killjoy. Personally, I think Calvin was serious and introspective, yes, but not necessarily a killjoy. His program of discipline, while shocking at times, is not the evil force of social control it's often presented as. But there's more as well. Like, when we look at Calvin's personality, those he was friends with, it's very clear that Calvin is not this kind of detached and cold and rational figure he's sometimes depicted as. The bromance, for example, between Calvin and Farel shows a much warmer and open side to him. At one point, Farel, speaking about their friendship, says, "Though I yield to Bucer in all things, yet in love and affection for you and reverence, I yield not at all." So you can see there already, there's a very close and warm friendship between him and Farel. Calvin likes his red wine, always in moderation, of course, but in the context of good company and good conversation, it's likely we would have seen a different and friendlier side to Calvin that's hard to get across when you're just reading words on a page. Calvin likes things being done unostentatiously, but well. So I'm in the process of learning Latin at the moment for my doctorate, but I'm reliably informed that Calvin's Latin is very elegant and clear. Latin is the primary language Calvin and most of the reformers published in. Constitutionally, Calvin is quite thin-skinned, and it's evident from his letters that when his opponents attack him in some way, that it cuts him really deeply. He has real moments of anxiety and worry, so Calvin sends the manuscript of his commentary on 2 Corinthians to Frankfurt, and it goes missing, and at that point Calvin seems to have a complete mental breakdown. Fortunately, the manuscript is found and the crisis is averted, but as Gordon puts it, Calvin was not play acting. Agitation about events, about the thoughts and actions of others, and about his own perceived inadequacies was a constant and unwelcome companion. So we've got this sort of interesting duality in Calvin. On the one hand, he could be very confident and strident and sometimes even ruthless when he was up in public. But then he also has this self-doubt and this insistence on self-examination and humility. And it's an interesting combination. Calvin is very concerned about his reputation and often gets very cross when he thinks his reputation has been unfairly dragged through the mud, though part of me thinks we're all like that to some degree. Ultimately, though, as Calvin lies on his deathbed, he's surrounded by a crowd of devastated friends and intimates who love him unswervingly despite his obvious personality flaws. They know he's a once-in-a-generation kind of person. The times I think Calvin seems furthest away from being a killjoy is when he's discussing the role of faith. Particularly in Book 3 of the Institutes. That's his book, The Institutes of the Christian Religion. And so talking about faith, Calvin says that faith is not apprehended by the understanding and memory alone, as other disciplines are, but it is received only when it possesses the whole soul and finds a seat and resting place in the inmost affection of the heart. Indeed, this emphasis on the heart is so important for Calvin that he can argue that true doctrine must enter our heart and pass into our daily living, and so transform us into itself that it may not be unfruitful for us. So you can hear, even just in those very quick quotes, that Calvin puts the human emotion at a really important point in his theology and in the Christian experience of God. Calvin does not see faith as this rational, conceptual thing alone. True faith powerfully moves the human affections, to trust and to reverence God. And in that, Calvin is actually very close to one of his heroes, St. Augustine. So is Calvin a killjoy? He certainly could be about some things, especially dancing. But if you want a rich and eloquent account of the role of human emotion in the life of faith, then you can't go wrong with Book 3 of Calvin's Institutes of the Christian Religion. You can read it for free online if you just Google it. As a person, Calvin might have been quite serious, but his vision of God and his theology is anything but dry, logical, and lifeless. It's really enjoyable to read. If you haven't already, give Book 3 of the Institutes a try and see what you think. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you for listening to the John Calvin podcast. For early access, bonus episodes, and a range of community benefits, sign up at johncalvinpod.com/support. That's johncalvinpod.com/support.